tortured, electrocuted, drowned, poisoned, eaten by ocean predators, systematically murdered by robots. Villains aren't the only ones with grim fates. Today we're ranking Pixar non-villain deaths, gruesome to most gruesome. We'll start with the characters who only briefly visited the pearly gates, or the other side. These are the revived deaths. There's not a lot to talk about in this category, so we'll be able to go into more detail, starting with Wade Ripple from Elemental. For those who haven't seen Pixar's newest non-sequel film, don't worry, it doesn't end so gruesomely. Wade does briefly seem to have died while trying to rescue Ember from the flood, and the heat in their shared space ultimately causes him to evaporate. At face value, the idea of literally evaporating sounds like a painful way to go. Like, water or not, Wade is literally being ripped apart piece by piece. But throughout the movie, we see Wade contort his body in all sorts of ways with seemingly no issue, so it's not too unreasonable to assume that this was totally painless for him. What's more, the way he's revived is by his girlfriend professing her love for him, causing him to cry tears of joy, turning him back into his old watery self. Things turned out just fine for Wade in the end, so even if I'd personally hate to be ripped apart piece by piece in a blazing inferno, I guess it wasn't so bad in this guy's case. Up next we have Paul from Soul. One of Pixar's most underrated movies, Soul sees the story of Joe Gardner's trek through the afterlife, and through that adventure he learns to appreciate the little things in life more than he ever had before. While Paul doesn't get nearly so much screen time, we can only hope he learned a similar lesson when Terry snatched his soul, mistaking him for Joe. Man, talk about racist, Terry. Paul did survive this without injury and even got some much needed advice to cut back on the processed junk food.
Seriously, stay away from those processed foods.
But we still have to consider this a worse fate than Wade's, because unlike with Wade, Paul's clearly gotten traumatized by the whole experience, and he didn't even get a fire spirit girlfriend out of it. Rounding out this category from the same movie, we have Joe Gardner. When your whole movie is about the afterlife and existentialism in general, it makes sense that your main character is gonna have to die. Thankfully for Joe, his death isn't too heavy. He fell into an open manhole that really should have been closed off more clearly, by the way, and apparently died on impact. However, instead of ending up in the Great Beyond, he ends up in the Great Before by mistake and is tasked with helping 22 learn how to live properly so we can get a second chance. While having to die on one of the best days of your life and having to work after your death is a pretty rough ending, we have to note that this isn't the actual end for Joe. After he goes back to the Great Before to rescue a forlorn 22, teaching her that life really is worth living after all, he's rewarded with a second chance to enjoy life for what it is. If he got anywhere near as much out of that life lesson as the audience did, I'd say that's a pretty huge upgrade to his life. With that, we've reached the end of the characters who cheated death. Now we'll move on to the characters who died of natural causes. Okay, grab your tissues, guys. I hear somber piano music in the background, and that can only mean Ellie Fredrickson from Up is next. A friend of Carl's since early childhood, they have one of the sweetest love stories in Pixar history. This couple fully saw life as a bundle of adventurous opportunities and couldn't wait to share that zest for life with a kid. Unfortunately, they were never able to have that kid, and before they had a chance to, Ellie sadly died of old age. As sad as it was, we can't really call this death gruesome. She seems to have died peacefully under the care of a clean hospital in the presence of her beloved husband. Considering the turmoil Carl went through after her death, I'd honestly say she got the more merciful end of things. But at least with Carl's newfound relationship with Russell, she kinda gets to be a mom from heaven, right? I'm not sure why, but it feels incredibly weird to be following up one of the most tragic deaths in Pixar history with that of Doc Hudson. Acting as Lightning McQueen's mentor in the first movie, Doc Hudson died before the events of the sequels. Not much is detailed about Doc's demise, so we can assume it was probably from natural causes, which, knowing how cars work in real life, I can imagine involves some kind of engine failure. Like Ellie, he presumably died of old age, but since we didn't see it on screen, we can't really conclude with certainty whether their deaths were the exact same level of brutal, or tame in this case. In a similar light, rounding out this category is Chef Auguste Gusteau from Ratatouille. He's one of those characters who died before the movie even started, and as a result it helped to kick off the events therein. Gusteau died shortly after Anton Ego gave his restaurant a not-so-glowing review, resulting in his restaurant losing one of its 5 stars. Dying of a broken heart is a truly depressing way to go, and while the movie doesn't go into detail about the specifics of the chef's death, we can assume he wasn't particularly at peace as a result of his downgrade to 4 stars if the news was enough to slowly take his life. Hopefully seeing his son's success from the Great Beyond will help him feel a little better in death. Now we'll move on to the more juicy stuff. These are the first cases of foul play on our list, the instant deaths. First up in this category, we have Future Socks from Lightyear. Lightyear is one of Pixar's most forgettable movies, but one thing we'll never forget is the sheer unadulterated rage we felt towards Zurg for betraying his alternate universe version of Socks. I mean, okay, granted, Socks technically betrayed him first, but considering his own version of Buzz had gone mad with power, I'd say he had a reason.
I like this new you.
Zurg responded by crushing this adorable robot kitten under his boot, killing him instantly. A far cry from the lovable adoptive dad we know and love from Toy Story 2.
I am your father.
I'll never forget you, sucks. And mostly because your present self didn't die, so this didn't really affect anything in the long run. Huh, what's more evil than a villain crushing one of their henchmen? Crushing two of them! Enter Axel and Loco from A Bug's Life. These two come up with the idea to simply not come back to the ant colony, but rather than actually pitch this idea to Hopper, they trick Molt into doing so instead. When Molt quickly folds and tells him those two were the ones who came up with the idea, Hopper takes the opportunity to teach a valuable lesson about strength in numbers. Like ants, for instance, 2 small seeds won't hurt you if you throw them at a grasshopper, but also, like ants, if you were to dump the entire bag of seeds on top of the grasshoppers, you'd have a double homicide on your hands. Something like that. Hopper is one of the most brutal villains in Pixar history. There aren't a lot of villains here willing to kill 2 of their allies just to prove a point.
Does anybody else want to stay?
Still, they were basically racist terrorists, so I'd say that crushing was more than earned. If that ain't shocking enough for you, closing out this category is Harry the Mosquito from the same film. Sure, he plays a much smaller role. In fact, he's literally just there for a 10-second bug zapper gag, but as annoying as mosquitoes are, we can't help but feel bad for Harry, who was so tempted by the light of the bug zapper that he couldn't help but move towards it.
I can't help it. It's so beautiful.
Not only did this lead to a seriously brutal shock, but given his scream afterwards, he was still alive as he fell to his death. As quick as it was, it must have been pretty rough for like 4 seconds. Hey, that could be a lot in mosquito time. Now we've reached our top 10. These are the painful demises for the characters who experienced deaths a little rougher than the average corpse. Who's your friend who likes to play bing bong, bing bong? Who's your friend who fades away? Bing bong. Bing Bong. Poor Bing Bong, man. It's hard enough to accept that Riley, the kid who's literally his entire world, has all but forgotten about him. But on top of that gut-wrenching development, he ends up fading away entirely to help Joy and Sadness get back to headquarters using the power of playtime. The only reason Bing Bong isn't any further on our lists is the fact that, unlike anyone else in this category, he did choose this fate to help his friends, accepting that his role in Riley's life was already complete. If nothing else, he was able to fade away peacefully, knowing that he had people who cared about him in the end. That's more than we can say for the dearly departed, or at least departed, Chicharron, one of Hector's old buddies in the realm of the dead. Cheech was a fellow musician who died of unknown causes, but if that tape on his head is any indication, it likely wasn't pleasant. That aside, Cheech is pretty unpopular with the other residents of the afterlife, which explains why he mostly keeps to himself, unless Hector feels like paying him a visit.
I don't want to see your stupid face.
Sadly though, his final moments come with the same scene that introduces him as he fades away, the reason for which being that his wife had finally forgotten him. Unless there's some kind of afterlife in the Coco universe, Chicharron just straight up stopped existing, simultaneously given the revelation that nobody in the living world cared about remembering him anymore. That is crushing, man. But not quite as crushing as what happened to Evelyn Dever's parents. One had such faith in superheroes that, upon having his home broken into by burglars, desperately called for them to bail him out. Unfortunately, his reliance on the now outlawed supers would prove to be his downfall, and when the robbers found him, he was shot point blank and killed. The feeling of terror and betrayal he must have felt in his final moments must have been awful, but I don't think his wife had it any easier since she died mere months later, likely of a broken heart.
She died a few months later. Heartbreak.
Honestly, it's hard to say which is worse, being killed by robbers or having to live without your spouse who was killed by robbers. And to make matters worse, these fates turned their daughter into a full-on supervillain, really driving in just how rough of a blow this was. Okay, we've talked about plenty of crushing deaths today, but few compared to that of Leland Turbo from Cars 2. The Lemons have committed no shortage of atrocious murders, but one of the worst was right near the beginning of the movie. Does anyone else ever feel a little bad watching stuff get crushed by hydraulic presses? Like, I know they're inanimate, but it still just looks really painful. Okay, well, imagine something sentient being crushed by one, and for that sentient being to be a vehicle whose corpse has now been mangled into something Wall-E would crank out. Even after all the stuff Finn McMissile has seen, this proved to be one of the worst, and even so, it's not the most brutal death in that movie. That honor goes to our final entry before the last category, the all-in-all victims. When Miles' Axelrod's alternative fuel turns out to be more dangerous than its users bargained for, the result is a lot of explosions. Not only does this lead to racers spontaneously exploding with seemingly no rhyme or reason, but it endangers and traumatizes the innocent cars in the audience watching. If it still sounds too silly to take seriously, just imagine watching a track meet where one of the racers just spontaneously combusts, and the audience is rightly shocked by the fact that a beloved celebrity just died and possibly took some others with him. Yeah, Cars 2 is a weird movie. But for our top 5, we've saved the most horrific deaths in Pixar's history, and to make it even rougher, all these guys are good guys. Get ready for this seriously brutal fate. At number 5, we have Henry. Arlo Arlo's dearly departed father. Yeah, who had good dinosaur on their bingo cards for this list, much less for the last category. Henry's death is pretty shocking, for something that happened so early in the movie especially. When his and Arlo's father-son hunting trip, we'll call it, is cut short by a sudden storm, he just barely manages to save his injured son from death, being swept away by the storm in the process. The man died to protect his son, and that's about the most noble death you could possibly die, but I can't deny that the pure shock he must have felt on the inside would have been horrific. Not to mention drowning, which would be a pretty tough way to go. Also, this is just speculation, but Henry's a dinosaur. As such, he's probably got huge lungs that would take longer than a human's to fully drown. I'm not an expert, but this is easily one of the more painful deaths in Pixar's history. But if you want to talk about emotionally painful deaths, Hector from Coco is one of the first to come to mind. Perhaps the most biting betrayal of the day, Hector was poisoned by Ernesto de la Cruz, his supposed best friend in the world. It was Hector's songs that said friend used to gain the fame he held so dearly, but that didn't make his friend any more loyal. You see, Hector made the absolutely horrible business decision to, get this, put his daughter before his music career? And old Ernie took that personally, so Hector was killed and deprived of a relationship with his daughter in the living world. To make matters worse, the rumor started to spread that Hector had abandoned his daughter and he had to watch De La Cruz remain beloved and remembered for decades while he was nearly forgotten altogether. The only thing keeping this one from falling any further is the fact that it's far from the most physically painful death, so it's just outside of our top 3. For our bronze medal of brutality, we have to mention some of Sid's toys. Sure, this kid isn't a full-on villain, but to these sentient toys, there are few people more monstrous and terrifying than Sid Phillips. From a combat Carl who was blown up for the sheer fun of it to his sister's numerous decapitated dolls, these toys had it rough, and those are the ones lucky enough to die instantly. Plenty of toys were ripped apart and had their parts combined with those of others, turning them into horrific, albeit kind-hearted, amalgamations of their former selves. Even if that doesn't quite count as death, I'd say it falls pretty close to the fate worse than death category. Sid really does have a penchant for toy terrorism, and these guys do not have a friend in him. At best, they have a death sentence in him, and it won't usually be a quick one. The silver medal of brutality goes to a pretty massive umbrella entry for Syndrome's super murder victims. But first, this video is brought to you by Wicked Binge channel memberships. You can gain access to our videos early before anyone else, plus gain access to members-only emojis and loyalty badges by supporting the channel through a membership. Syndrome had quite possibly the most terrifying plan in Pixar history, with the conviction that when everyone's super, then no one will be. He planned to systematically murder the supers by luring them to an isolated island to be killed by gigantic robots. These murders were thought out quite thoroughly, to the point where these high-profile, now outlawed supers were considered missing persons for years before Mr. Incredible finally uncovered his old and unknown nemesis's plan. While big robots make super go boom doesn't sound like it warrants such a low place on its own, it's worth noting that these guys were lured in with the promise of more hero work. Finally, after being forbidden from using their powers to help others, they were allowed to go do so again, only to find out that it was a scheme for this frustrated, brilliant dork to murder them. Gazerbeam stands out particularly though, since he's the only one whose death is described in further detail. He was trapped in a cave by the Omnidroid V5 where he starved to death. That's an outright horrific way to go. But if you ask me, it's absolutely nothing compared to the deaths of Coral and 399 out of 400 of her unborn children. Finding Nemo is a classic, heartfelt movie about a dad going on an adventure to rescue his son. It's also the tragedy of a paranoid man who drives his son away through the trauma he suffers after watching his wife and nearly all of his children die right in front of his eyes. All but one egg, that of the titular Nemo, are killed in the first scene of the movie by a vicious barracuda. How many eggs, you may ask? About 400.
There's over 400 eggs.
I want you to think about that. 400 babies. Had Coral listened to Marlin and rushed back to the anemone, it might have turned out differently. Maybe the barracuda hadn't even seen the eggs. But a good mother sensing that her babies are in danger is thinking about nothing else in that moment, and despite Marlin's fruitless efforts to fight it off, he's knocked out by the barracuda and wakes up to his wife and 99.75% of his children being just gone. No burial, no goodbyes, nothing. They were all just eaten alive by a monstrous predator within mere moments. It's one of the most gut-wrenching scenes in Pixar history, and we can't think of any other death in the studio's history worthy of this gold medal of brutality.
Coral?
On a related note, I think we might want to redux our Pixar villain ranking again as an excuse to verbally demolish this barracuda.